From its inception, the July monarchy had been unable to address the many problems plaguing French society. A growing Republican opposition, mixed with labor unrest, revealed the precarious situation confronted by the regime as street protests erupted throughout the decade. Radicals in the streets of Paris were not the only threat. Abroad, the French military was engaged in a protracted conflict against Algerian insurgents as it attempted to pacify France's new North African colony. However, overall, the economic prosperity generated during the 1830s proved enough to sustain support for the government at home. The bourgeoisie made profits while workers had jobs, discouraging any form of mass protest. Yet during the mid-1840s, this situation changed. An economic downturn brought an end to the boom years of growth and prosperity. Those hit hardest by the Depression were workers and small business owners. These groups could not defend their interest in politics due to the voting qualifications. The only means at their disposal were therefore street demonstrations, and this form of activism was met with resistance from the police and military. Soon enough, small rebellions were being waged in major French cities, where barricades were thrown up in the working-class neighborhoods and workers and radicals took to the streets. This situation became ever more dire after 1846. That year, the French wheat harvest failed, producing a severe food shortage throughout the country. In addition to economic and social grievances, hunger was now added to the list. Broad calls for economic reform became the battle cry of hungry workers and reformers who demanded a voice in government. Yet to these calls, Guizot only gave his characteristic reply of "get rich." It was a telling indication that the disenfranchised could expect nothing from the government. To circumvent the censorship laws in place, Republicans drawing support from small business owners and laborers began staging banquets. Under this banquet campaign, people would be invited to attend a large dinner which was ostensibly apolitical in nature. In reality, however, these gatherings quickly turned political, with criticism of the government vocalized and discussed. In this way, Republican opponents sought to avoid state censorship policies and rally supporters. The government was not deceived by this strategy and knew what Republicans were actually doing at these banquets. Therefore, when authorities got news of a large banquet scheduled in Paris on February 22, 1848, the government decided to make an example of it. When guests arrived at the banquet hall, they found the doors to the room blocked by the police. With their access to the hall barred, the arriving Republicans decided to take their message to the streets. By the following day, crowds were gathering outside the Ministry of Justice, brandishing signs criticizing the government and calling for Guizot's resignation. Faced with a large protest right in the center of the capital, soldiers were called in to ensure that order was maintained. In one encounter, soldiers came face to face with protesters, and in this tense moment, soldiers accidentally fired on the crowd, killing 52 people. With blood now spilled, radicals began organizing an effective response. By the next day, Paris was once again embroiled in a revolutionary uprising. Faced with unrest in the streets, Louis-Philippe immediately abdicated his throne, putting an end to the July monarchy. In its place, a new republic was declared, the Second Republic. Workers were adamant to have their grievances addressed and demanded a socialist government that would resolve their hardships and give them a voice in government. Conservatives and moderates had no intention of tolerating a socialist regime. As Alexis de Tocqueville proclaimed, "The Republic of February must be democratic, but it must not be socialist." At the moment, however, there was little choice in this matter, lest another revolution ensue. Social tensions had provoked the revolutionary uprising of 1848 in Paris, and the workers were going to have to be appeased. Conservatives could only wait and bide their time. In the meantime, the Republican socialist Louis Blanc set up a provisional government that intended to solve the problems caused by unemployment and industrialization. Every worker, he believed, had a right to work, and the state was obliged to secure this right. To this end, he authorized the creation of state-sponsored workshops. These workshops were charged with creating jobs for the unemployed, realizing Blanc's right-to-work policy in France. Henceforth, laborers unable to secure work would be employed by the state. At the same time, universal manhood suffrage was declared, ensuring that workers would have a voice in politics. In line with the expectations of the left, the February uprising would be a social revolution, one that would bring forth a social republic. The social revolution led by Blanc occurred simultaneously with the Second National Revolution in France, although one further afield. With the declaration of the Second Republic, French colonists in Algeria equally began putting forth their own demands for national representation, giving the Revolution of 1848 a trans-Mediterranean dimension. Yet Algeria was not France. Settlers did not have the same political and civil liberties as their French compatriots in the metropole. Moreover, relations with the natives also played a factor in colonial politics. Muslim resistance was by no means quelled in the colony. Radical revolution threatened to weaken the colonial government, and with it, encourage native revolts that could undermine French control in Africa. In spite of these concerns, it was difficult to ignore the fact that settlers resented military rule and were especially aggrieved by their lack of political rights. Equality demanded that they should possess the basic rights enjoyed by all French citizens, they argued. If universal suffrage was instituted in France, it should also be imposed in Algeria. On this question, there could be little room for debate in the minds of the colonists. Since 1830, colonists had always been at the whim of the military and the government in Paris. However, with the Revolution of 1848, colonists believed they now had a chance to improve their fortunes. That March, French colonists in Algiers began forming political clubs to press their demands on the new republic. They declared their allegiance to the new republic, stating, "Frenchmen of the mother country and Frenchmen of Algeria, we are the same people." This argument in favor of Algerian national inclusion and assimilation found support among key Republicans in Paris who sought to cultivate closer ties to the colonists. That spring, the three North African provinces of Algiers, Constantine, and Oran were incorporated directly into France proper, appeasing the colonial lobby. Colonists were permitted to elect deputies to the National Assembly in Paris, giving them a voice in the government for the first time. Republicans openly supported Algerian colonization, hoping to use the empire to foster nationalist sentiments among voters and the general population. They committed the new government to the French civilizing mission, echoing the calls of Algérie Française vocalized by colonists. Yet behind this lofty rhetoric of civilizing Muslim Africa, conservatives saw a more practical application. In spreading civilization across Africa, why couldn't unemployed workers be shipped across the Mediterranean and take up the plow there? From their inception, Blanc's workshops had never sat well with peasants or the middle classes, who saw his socialist policies as too expensive and wasteful. Algeria provided a perfect solution to the problems of socialism and unemployment at home. Colonization could rid the capital of the unseemly and routing working-class elements that threaten stability, all in the name of fulfilling the nation's civilizing mission abroad. As Blanc's government became increasingly unpopular that summer, conservatives seized the moment to implement their strategy. They began summarily dismantling the workshops and scaling back the socialist policies Blanc had enacted, brusquely indicating the socialist experiment was over. When these changes were announced, workers took to the streets. They had believed that the revolution of 1848 would be a victory for the working classes. Now, they had been betrayed. On June 22nd, barricades were thrown up throughout the capital as radicals and workers fought to defend their dream of a social republic. The so-called Red Days of June were the most traumatic social conflict France had yet experienced. Worker resistance compelled the government to call in the military and suppress the uprising. Unsurprisingly, most of these generals had made names for themselves fighting in Algeria, often using brutal tactics against native insurgents. These same tactics were now used mercilessly on the Parisian working classes. Over the following days, a tenuous order was restored, leaving the streets of the capital littered with bodies and soaked in blood. In the aftermath of the June days, the government had little patience for worker demands. Socialism posed an imminent threat and needed to be purged from the country. Worker organizations were suppressed. Working-class newspapers were rigorously censored and shut down. Political radicals and the unemployed who posed a threat to social order were deported to Algeria. Over the next 3 years, nearly 12,000 workers were shipped across the Mediterranean, some voluntarily and others by force. This aggressive form of state-sponsored colonization marked an attempt to put an end once and for all to the social question in France. With the socialists defeated and order restored, the last piece of the puzzle was the presidential election scheduled for December 1848. A strong conservative candidate was needed, but one who could appeal to a wide array of voters. It was especially important to appeal to the newly enfranchised peasants, who were now the vast majority of the electorate in France. That autumn, a promising candidate came forward, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the famous general. A newcomer to French politics, it was believed that Louis Napoleon would cater to conservative and middle-class elites in return for being elected head of state. The name Bonaparte was popular among the peasantry, who fondly remembered his uncle as the man who had given them land. In essence, Louis Napoleon seemed the perfect candidate. a conservative who could pose as a popular and progressive leader, a politician capable of rallying liberals while catering to the interests of elite and the business classes. In his run for president, Louis campaigned as a man of order who could restore authority and prosperity to France. His message was clear and convincing. When all the votes were counted, Louis Napoleon was elected President of the Republic by a significant majority. 33 years after Waterloo, a Bonaparte was once again head of state in France. Louis Napoleon's victory came as a shock to the left, but it was difficult to deny that his campaign had responded to pervasive fears among French elites. The Red Days of June had horrified both liberals and conservatives, who believed that radical socialism posed a dire threat to society. Appeals to order were exactly what elites wanted to hear, and Louis Napoleon claimed to offer this. Upon assuming the presidency, he was committed to make good on his promise. He quickly put together a political coalition that took the informal name the Party of Order. This coalition pledged to fight against radicalism and pursue a moderate course of action, drawing middle-class elites to its platform. Yet Louis proved effective at garnering support from other groups as well. During his campaign, he had mobilized Catholic support behind his election. Alienated by the secular policies of the French Revolution and July monarchy, Catholics worried over their power and influence in society. Sensitive to their concerns, Louis signaled to leading Catholic spokesmen that, if elected, he would ensure Catholic interests were addressed. This strategy won him the Catholic vote. After the election, however, he was going to have to make good on his promises if he intended to retain the support of the Catholic bloc. Taken together, it was evident that Louis Napoleon was going to have to follow a more or less conservative course of action to appease those groups that had supported him during the presidential race. As one of his first measures, Louis wed his anti-socialist campaign with his pro-Catholic policies. Conservatives in France had been clamoring for greater control over national education, insisting that the secular schools created by Guizot were hotbeds of radical and socialist ideas. Catholics led the charge, demanding greater influence over national education. In their view, religious instruction encouraged respect for authority and nurtured wholesome Christian morals in children, combating dangerous ideas spread by freethinkers and anarchists. Realizing that his political platform of social order dovetailed with Catholic demands, Louis intended to consolidate his conservative base. In 1850, he ordered his Minister of Education, Count Alfred de Falloux, to draw up new legislation focused on the national education system. Falloux appointed a commissioner made up of reactionary conservatives and liberals to draft the new laws. Religion was called upon to sanitize the national education system. Teachers suspected of spreading radical and anti-Christian ideas were summarily dismissed. Catholic schools were given a veritable carte blanche to teach whatever they wanted, while public institutions became subject to direct state supervision. Religious officials were even selected to oversee state exams and guarantee conformity of instruction. Following these laws on education, Louis next took measures to suppress the political extremism which had torn French society apart. To stifle his opponents, newspaper editors were now required to put up caution money in order to publish. Small presses favorable to the left, which could not afford to pay, were forced to close. The electoral laws were also revised to ensure a more moderate electorate. Although universal suffrage was upheld, rules governing voter eligibility were imposed that stripped poor workers of their political rights. Laws were also passed forbidding anyone convicted of a crime to run for political office, intentionally targeting revolutionaries and political conspirators. As a result, socialists and militant Republicans had little choice but to meet in secret, creating an underground leftist movement that the secret police constantly attempted to infiltrate and break up. If this conservative turn worked in the short term, Louis realized it could not be maintained indefinitely. Pandering to reactionaries would undoubtedly stoke another leftist revival in the country. He understood that the Party of Order desired to return to the policies of the July monarchy, a scenario that could hardly end well. Louis needed to free himself from the small faction of conservative elites who had brought him to power, lest he find himself in the same position of Louis Philippe. It was imperative to break with the Party of Order. The question was, how was this to be done? And for a new and ambitious Napoleon, history provided an example. Louis Napoleon's presidency was set to expire at the end of 1852. According to the Constitution, no president could run for re-election. Convinced that conservatives would make the same mistakes they had under the July monarchy, Louis Napoleon had no desire to give up power just yet. To do so would likely invite another revolution, one that might finally push French society into the abyss. Louis felt assured that the military and peasantry would support him and provide a base on which to build a potential Bonapartist movement in the country. Moreover, he believed he could draw Catholics and middle-class elites to his side, exploiting fears over socialism and worker militancy to gain their support. Sizing all of this up, Louis recognized that he did not necessarily need to pander to conservative liberals. His ability to appeal to different groups meant he could form a popular and national government. To this end, in December of 1851, while the National Assembly was in session, Louis ordered generals loyal to him to march into the chamber and arrest the delegates. The assembly was dissolved and political opponents jailed. Following in his uncle's footsteps, Louis had carried out a military coup against a French republic, putting himself at the head of a new government. It looked as though the past was repeating itself, and the following year, the Bonapartists issued a national plebiscite asking the people if they would like Louis Napoleon to replace the Second Republic with a new French Empire. With political opponents safely jailed, the people went to the polls, and when the votes were counted, the people authorized Louis Napoleon to create a second Napoleonic Empire headed by a Bonaparte who took the title of Napoleon III. The architects of the Second Empire claimed that they wanted to solve the problems that plagued French society. Yet since the new government had been established by an illegal coup, it was compelled to rely upon a heavy-handed bureaucracy to impose its will and ensure that order was preserved and political extremism kept at bay. Republicans were driven underground and subject to police surveillance, while the state took an active role in monitoring elections to the national parliament, the revived Corps Législatif. Although elections were carried out under universal suffrage, state officials were instructed to promote candidates favorable to the regime in their local departments and ensure that opponents did not win seats in the parliament. Oppressive policies alone could not, however, sustain the new government, and Napoleon III knew it. The government would have to promote a new sense of national unity capable of binding the country together, and with it, binding the people to the government. Since the French Revolution, France had been bitterly divided. Political partisanship had made democratic government nearly impossible, leaving the country divided between liberals and conservatives, between religious authorities and secularists, and, most importantly, between those who supported the ideals of the revolution and those who did not. Socialism and class conflict had only served to exacerbate these existing divisions, leaving many to wonder if the country would not hopelessly spiral into an abyss of repeated revolutions, coups, and social antagonisms. Coming to power, Napoleon III and his Bonapartist entourage claimed that they wanted to close the political and social rifts afflicting the country. The Second Empire, they insisted, was to be a government of national unity and reconciliation. France's problems could only be solved by a new Napoleon, a strong leader capable of uniting divisive political factions and inspiring confidence in the country. To this end, Napoleon III and the Second Empire promoted an energetic French nationalism. Universal suffrage was maintained, entailing that all Frenchmen should see themselves as equal citizens invested with the same rights and responsibilities that belonged to every French citizen. Equality, one of the key ideals of the French Revolution, was to become a definitive feature of French political life and national identity. The Bonapartists encouraged politicians to put aside their differences and see themselves as a single French people united by a common leader, a shared history, and a common national cause. They made appeals to French nationalité by staging large parades in which people waved flags and expressed their patriotism. Government officials were instructed to seek out old soldiers who had fought in the Napoleonic Wars and have them sing patriotic songs and depict Napoleon III as a man of the people. Bonapartism, state officials claimed, was a political idea born in the cottages of the people rather than in the salons of elites. It was therefore something common to everyone. By the early 1860s, one political critic testified to the new sense of national pride and unity that the Second Empire had inspired in the country, remarking, "Nationality is now the real religion in France." Napoleon III thought of himself as a nation builder, a leader capable of rallying Frenchmen around a common cause and common government. And while his nationalist rhetoric drew the support of peasants and workers, it was going to take more than just patriotic speeches to draw the support of the elite classes. Industry and economic development were also fervently promoted by the Second Empire, in an effort to draw the bourgeoisie and business classes to the government. In improving the French economy, Napoleon III hoped to stimulate prosperity and discourage the poverty and unemployment that had made radicalism and socialism so appealing fast. To fight socialism, the empire committed itself to a vigorous economic policy. The state invested large sums of money in rail construction, creating a national rail system that stimulated industrial growth. French industry and manufacturing was also promoted, with a new national bank supplying capital to French entrepreneurs to develop national industries and compete with Great Britain. With the growth of industry, jobs were created, combating the unemployment that had plagued France during the 1840s. The government also gave employment to workers by implementing large-scale building projects and public works. French cities became subject to state-sponsored beautification projects and urban renewal. Under Napoleon III, building projects in Algeria effectively gave the major cities of the colony a French character and identity. Today, Algiers is an entirely European city, the French tourist Charles-Thierry Meg remarked in 1860. The Arabs that one sees there already seem so completely exiled that it is popularly said they now only serve as ornaments for the landscape, and to remind people that Algiers was not always a French city. Civilization, it seemed, was bent on tearing down everything that was not in accordance with its tastes, as French buildings replaced the native Moorish architecture. Yet the most pronounced and dramatic effects of these building projects took place in Paris. Louis desired to build an impressive capital for his new French empire, believing that Paris could become a new world capital where industry, prosperity, and the fruits of civilization were on display for all to see. Beginning in the mid-1850s, Napoleon III hired the planner Baron Georges Haussmann to draw up designs for gentrifying the city. New boulevards and parks were created, while the old medieval buildings that had once lined streets were torn down and replaced by new and more opulent buildings that would become quintessential marks of the modern Parisian landscape. Gentrification increased property values in urban areas, and it was expected that these modern and stylish homes and apartments would be purchased by new bourgeois residents. These renters would spend their money on luxury items, leisure activities, and other amenities, encouraging the development of local businesses. During the years of the Second Empire, the first department stores like the Bon Marché were opened up, where goods were displayed and sold to a growing number of middle-class consumers. Remodeling the capital also had a strategic objective in line with Napoleon III's commitment to order and security. Whereas working-class insurgents had customarily taken to the small, narrow medieval streets and thrown up barricades during times of unrest, now, the wide boulevards, broad avenues, and open areas created by Haussmann would make these types of revolutions impossible. Moreover, the gentrification of Paris also meant that workers were not able to afford the new apartments and homes being built. Construction projects broke up many of the old working-class neighborhoods once familiar to Paris, pushing laborers to the periphery of the city as new bourgeois renters occupied the center. The embourgeoisement of Paris was intended to ensure that the French capital, once the heart of revolutionary activity in the country, no longer posed an obstacle to social stability. By the turn of the decade, Napoleon III had managed to show himself to be a man of order, but also a patron of industry and national prosperity. Under his rule, confidence returned to French finances and the economy boomed. On top of this, these feats were carried out under a government supporting mass democracy. If universal suffrage had been condemned by liberals as a threat to stability and order in the past, Napoleon III revealed that democracy and order could coexist. Universal suffrage need not be anarchic, and could, in fact, even be used to support a conservative yet progressive government. Yet for all its achievements, the Second Empire was and remained an illegitimate and authoritarian regime. It relied upon an army of state bureaucrats and prefects to impose its ambitious plans on the country, pushing through state-sponsored liberal projects that endeavored to quiet the furies of revolution at home. However, questions remained. Could a Bonaparte reconcile the old hatreds between Catholics, liberals, and Republicans? Could a progressive and nationalist state unite a nation sharply divided over issues of identity, faith, and common values? This had yet to be seen, leaving critics to wonder whether the old revolutionary furies of the past had finally been put to rest.